Certainly is. 25 minutes to 2. Great to have your company. Well, believe it or not, it's National Science Week, a time to celebrate the wonderful work our scientists perform around Australia. But it's not all about test tubes and Bunsen burners. Just imagine for a moment what the world would be like, what world we would be living in if we didn't have the wider world of science. There'd be no technology, no engineering. That means no mobile phones. That might be good. But no internet. No modern cars. We'd even still be using wood ovens and perhaps stoking the copper to do the washing each week. Let's not even think about what our health would be like. So let's meet some of South Australia's top scientists, including our chief scientist, Dr. Leanna Reid. Hello, Leanna.
Very glad to be here.
Good to see you. Professor Anton van Hengel. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Did I get it right?
Pretty close.
Pretty close?
Hengel.
Okay, good. And the man who was crowned Scientist of the Year last Friday, Professor James Paton. How are you? Good to see you all. Look, let's start with you, perhaps, Leanna, as Chief Scientist for South Australia. Firstly, what does a Chief Scientist do? Are you the boss of all this mob, or what?
I'm definitely the boss of this mob, yeah. No, I'm here to give my sagely advice to the government, but I really see my role as advocacy for our scientists and really helping to grow the recognition of it, like we're talking about today.
And part of the problem is, isn't it, most of what you achieve goes on in the background, doesn't receive a great deal of publicity, you know, in comparison to other things in the news cycle. But there's an awful lot of work going on out there that we should be applauding.
Absolutely, and just to reinforce your point, our previous Chief Scientist for Australia, Ian Chubb, did a survey of Year 11 and 12 students, and only 4% of them thought that science was almost always useful in their everyday life, while, of course, they're talking on their mobile phones and doing all the rest of the things that you talked about. So it's absolutely crucial that we get the message out there.
And there's a bit of a stereotype, isn't there, of you know, scientists wearing the lab coat, as I said, the Bunsen burner and, you know, the test tube and so forth. Science is much more than the laboratory.
Oh, it is in all sorts of directions now. It's information technologies, the artificial intelligence that Anton will talk about, or a great variety of fields. In fact, it's just everywhere. So it's definitely not the stereotypes of the past.
So if you're talking about, 4% of the kids not appreciating it, and we know we're not getting enough kids going into the field of science and technology and so forth, how do we get over that? What do we do? You have in the high schools and our secondary schools, we have the science buffs and we have the non-science buffs. There's a bit of a chasm there, isn't there?
There is, and it really is quite a challenge. And you're right that we do have to get over that because, the reasons that we said. And, you think of life expectancy, for example. If you were born in 1900, you probably didn't live past the age 50. Your life expectancy is about 80. The children of our children will have a life expectancy of about 100. I mean, that's really within one generation. It's amazing what's happening. So we have to get people to understand that. The other aspect, I think, is that science will underpin most jobs in future. So 75% of the fastest growing occupations are already require those STEM, science, technology, engineering, maths, skills. So being skilled in science is crucial to your jobs of the future to do that. How do we do it? There's no one answer. That's why we have the Science Awards. It's perhaps to give recognition. A colleague of mine said that he thought it would be great to bring his son along because he would actually get a chance to see in action what he was learning at school. And I think that's the key, really, that our children more and more, relative to when I went to school, where they said, you've got to do maths. So, okay, I'll do maths. More and more you have to do it in the context of why am I doing this? What's its application? Why is it relevant to me? So the really excellent schools, of which we have many, are teaching now and saying, here's a problem. What's the chemistry? What's the physics? What's the maths around it? And that's the answer perhaps in future, so that when those kids are going through high school, they won't lose interest because they'll say, gee, this is going to be important for me. And they'll go to university and we hope and more get the jobs of the future.
And the other thing too is we've got to keep in mind there's an awful lot of kids out there, the jobs that they will be performing in later life haven't even been invented yet.
Yes, it's very exciting. Actually, it was in my case, and maybe it was for my colleagues as well, but I ended up running a biotechnology company. Well, I could hardly say I was going to do that because biotechnology didn't really exist when I was just starting university. So it's very true, and there are a whole range of occupations that don't exist now. And the other thing we like to say is that to our students is, and you might be the one to invent them. So that's another, getting our kids to be more entrepreneurial and start their own companies, grow those companies of the future is going to be crucial.
And it doesn't necessarily wipe out the kids, as I mentioned before, who are on the other side of the chasm in the classroom, who are perhaps the arties or the more visual people, not the maths and science people. It doesn't mean that they are not able to actually extend their interest into that area.
We often talk about, instead of STEM, it's STEAM now. So we put arts into the STEM, technology, engineering, arts and maths. Because of that, because the interface is very important. It's sort of, I guess, design thinking, if you like, is often called. But the other aspect is that if the average person nowadays is not attuned to science to some degree, and as you say, there'll be different levels of that, then how are they going to interpret all the things that are going on? If the world is becoming so technologically focused and advanced, then everyone needs a good education in it. And also, I think, we're in this post-truth world that we hear about all the time. How are you able to distinguish when someone tells you that vaccinations are really bad for you? How do you make the judgment? You read it on Facebook and whatever social media. You have to be in a position to be able to make some informed decisions. So I believe everybody needs a good foundation in science.
Well, look, we've also got in the studio with us two of the gentlemen who won some of the science awards that were on last Friday. Let's start with you, Professor Paton, Scientist of the Year. Congratulations for a start.
Thank you very much.
Not a bad gig.
Yes.
Long time coming?
Yes, I suppose I've been in this game since about 1980, and I did my PhD and finished that in 1979. So basically, all of my sort of postdoctoral career has been working in this sort of area of infectious diseases.
And to pick up the point that we were discussing a moment ago, we made the point about the debate about vaccinations and so forth. We need to have an understanding, don't we?
Oh, absolutely, yes. And I think we talk a lot these days about the threat sort of being posed by superbugs that are resistant to antibiotics. Well, one way of dealing with that issue is by having vaccines to prevent the diseases in the first place. The spread of superbugs is driven by frequent use of antibiotics in the community, and if you don't get the infection, you don't get a prescription for an antibiotic, and you reduce that sort of Darwinian selective pressure for both evolution and spread of multiply resistant bacteria throughout both human and animal populations. And so, vaccination is really the central plank of management of infectious diseases. It was the only thing we had prior to the development of antibiotics in the 1940s and 50s. And it remains probably one of the strongest weapons in our armoury for moving forward into the future.
So there's two issues there in the debate. There's firstly the anti-vaccine voice, which seems to get an awful good hearing.
Yeah.
That must frustrate the absolutely
it is
willing
frustrating,
attitude.
and I suppose until sort of the advent of the internet, it was reasonably easy. It was difficult for people like that to get a voice. The problem now with sort of, as you say, social media, and if people do a Google search on vaccination, sometimes the website names are misleading, to say the least, in terms of the likelihood of getting good information out of them. And some of the claptrap which was put up there is just worrying. And you don't like to think of censorship, but boy, you'd like to take the microphone away from them.
But there were figures released this weekend that were actually quite frightening as to the pockets of communities all around Australia, but including here in Adelaide, who have really incredibly low rates of vaccinations.
Yeah, and remarkably, some of the lowest rates are in some of the more, sort of upper socioeconomic areas. That seem, maybe these are people who have got, more of these people have got computers and are searching and finding the wrong sort of information out there. I suppose this can only be sort of combated by broader education programs from the earliest of ages, so that people really understand the benefits. We think about, the only infectious disease which has been wiped from the face of the earth was smallpox. That was achieved, largely under the guidance of the late Frank Fenner, by the widespread use of an effective vaccine. And that vaccine was actually essentially developed, at least the forerunner of it, by Jenner back in the late 1700s, based on empirical observations. And so here you saw the basic scientific principles of looking at what's happening around you, wondering why it's happening, making the observation that milkmaids that got cowpox from their work never got smallpox when outbreaks occurred, and then the recognition that therefore this, if you gave people cowpox, which was a non-life-threatening infection, you could protect them from the really big one. And that's the only one time it's worked. The other thing, I suppose, about infectious diseases, which is worth considering, is that they still kill more than 30% of the people on this planet, and there's only been 2 occasions in human history where the population of the Earth has actually decreased, and it wasn't the Great War or anything like that. It was, in fact, the first, one of them was the Great Flu pandemic, which spread around in 1918-19, and prior to that, when that killed something like 50 million people. And before that, we saw the Black Death in the 14th century, the bubonic plague, which killed about half of the population of Europe, without sort of accurate figures from elsewhere. So we can get the message across that infectious diseases are still really big ticket items in terms of the burden of disease in our community, and also particularly in underprivileged communities.
How frustrating is it for you guys as scientists to keep on reading the data that the overuse of antibiotics, for example, is just helping us lose this battle against infectious diseases and illnesses going forward? I mean, it's a pretty simple message. Don't, for the doctors for a start, don't overprescribe antibiotics, and for the patients, don't take them. Yeah,
look, it seems like a simple message, but the amount of antibiotics that are used is quite staggering. There's a lot of guidelines in place to limit the use of antibiotics, which are frontline medicines in humans. Their use is they're not used in livestock, for example, but nevertheless there's concerns about cross sort of resistance which could occur by related antibiotics being used in one field or the other. But you think about one of the problems we've got is that many infections, upper respiratory infections, the vast majority are viral. But we have situations like meningococcal disease, which is something where early use of antibiotics is absolutely critical if the patient is to survive without life-changing disability. Then that has to be recognised very early and prescribed, and these early stages of infection are very difficult to distinguish from a viral infection, and so this is a great burden on a clinician trying to make that judgment. Is this just an ordinary viral infection, or could it be these rare cases? And meningococcal disease, it gets a lot of publicity, but it is very rare. Could it be one of these? If they get that one wrong, then the chances of that patient surviving are much lower than they would have been. So it's a dilemma for everybody. One of the ways which we're sort of trying to address, apart from the vaccination side of things, to reduce the requirement for the use of antibiotics, but is also to think of sort of novel ways of blocking infections. And we can think about antibiotics is that they're developed largely from compounds naturally produced by one microorganism to kill its neighbours and give itself an advantage either in the environment or in a host niche or something like that. And so this means that it has to have a mechanism itself to stop itself being killed by its own weaponry. So therefore, if there's a naturally produced antibiotic, there almost by definition must exist somewhere in nature genes encoding the capacity to be resistant to it, and it's simply then just a matter of those genes being transmitted horizontally from one strain of bacterium to another, or from a fungus to a bacterium. And bacteria are very, very good at mixing and matching their DNA. They shuffle it around at very high rates, and this is why resistance can spread so rapidly. So we're looking at ways where we're selecting targets and developing completely novel drugs which don't have any sort of resemblance to things which occur in nature, and these ones should be refractory to the evolution of resistance, or at least resistance might take much longer to develop.
Certainly a challenge, and one of many. We're talking to some of the state's top scientists. If you want to have a chat, 8223 0000. 7 minutes away from 2 o'clock, and we've got some... well, the IQ of the studio has gone up remarkably in the last 20 minutes, I can assure you. We've got our Chief Scientist of South Australia, Dr. Leanna Reid, with us, Professor Anton van de Hengel. Oh, look, I'm getting better. I'll get there. And our Scientist of the Year, Professor James Paton, with us. Big announcements made on Friday night. And Anton, congratulations, you got a gong.
Thank you very much.
What was your gong for?
So it was a collaboration award for a project that we ran with a local SME called LBT Innovations. So it's, well, we constructed a device with them. We did the technology development on a device called APAS, which is an automated plate reader for agar plates. So agar plates are what pathologists use to grow specimens on. So if you have a blood test or some other kind of test, they will put some of it on one of these agar plates and allow it to incubate for a while and look at what's on there in order to figure out what you've got. And the technology we developed takes photos of those plates and then analyses the images to see what is growing on them. And it allows the pathologists to focus on the cases they should be focusing on, greatly reduces the cost of that pathology process. But it also has created a great business opportunity for a South Australian SME. The product got FDA approval, which means that the American Food and Drug Administration have certified it as being able to be used in a medical process in America, and that's the primary test for these kinds of devices internationally. And achieving that kind of approval is, well, it's an incredible process, I can tell you. You have to deliver trailer loads of documentation to these people, but it makes a huge difference, and having had that device achieve that approval gives a fantastic business opportunity for an amazing local SME.
And that sort of pretty well sums up where we're coming from in this conversation, doesn't it, Leanna? South Australia's role on the world stage is actually, we're taking a bigger chunk of that stage every year, aren't we?
We are. We have tremendous research capabilities, and Anton's work is helping us to address the next challenge, and that's convert that into companies that we hope will stay here and grow in South Australia versus go off to the US and so forth. And so those companies, the companies that are going to succeed in future, are going to have much more a strong technology focus. And so that's exactly the LBT is exactly the kind of company we want to grow here.
Which, again, we come back to where we began. Getting the younger generations interested and involved in science. Are we heading down the right path?
We're heading down there. It's slower than I would like it to be, but we are starting to make some changes. You know, I think our teachers are probably, we have some unsung hero awards for scientists who, you know, are not out there. I think all scientists are unsung heroes because we're not the type to really laud ourselves to the world. And I think, you know, I think they're rock stars to the people who won these awards. But we do have some we call, actually do call unsung heroes. And I think teachers are that. We give some awards to teachers because the teachers who, at the end of the day, you think back to why are you what you are now. It's probably that a teacher inspired you somewhere along the way. I am what I am because of a science teacher. So they're absolutely crucial, and that's where the effort, I think, is going in. I think we need to look at how we pay our teachers and reward them, and also how those teachers teach, so that the teaching has to be much more in the context of why is this important to learn this bit of chemistry, which is hard and I'm finding a bit less interesting than going off and playing footy or whatever. At the end of the day, when children understand why they're doing something, they're much more engaged.
Absolutely, and as with everything, but particularly in this case. Listen, thank you so much. A really interesting area of discussion, and one that we could spend the next 2 hours on, but unfortunately we can't. If kids or parents are interested in discovering this a little bit more, where should they go?
Well, we have RIOS is a good entity which is there to promote science. So they could contact RIOS and they'll direct people to where they want to get more information.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming in, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time at the next awards.
Thank you.
Fantastic. It's a couple of minutes away from 2. Coming up after 2 o'clock, we're going to check in with the Windmill Theatre and their latest production. It's called Beep.